This is the very real emotion of a UN spokesman who broke down on air during a television interview about the situation in Gaza.
The rights of Palestinians, even their children, are wholesale denied, and it's appalling. My pleasure.
Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now, I'm delighted to be joined here today at the Interpal 20th Anniversary Symposium by Chris Gunness, the UN spokesperson for UNWRA, the United Nations Works Relief Agency in Gaza. It's a relief and human development agency originally intended to provide jobs on public works projects and direct relief to 652,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting that followed the end of the British mandate over the region of Palestine. But today, UNWRA provides education, healthcare and social services to up to 5 million registered Palestinian refugees, including survivors from the 48 and 67 wars and their descendants. It represents the main international agency expected to pick up the pieces from the recent assault on Gaza by the Israeli government. Assalamu alaikum, Chris Gunness.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to Islam Time.
Thank you very much.
Now, I was struck, as indeed were many others, by the dramatic headlines in July which read, UN spokesperson breaks down during interview on Gaza. You were being interviewed on Al Jazeera about the attack on a UN shelter at the time. I know that you're a seasoned reporter, an operator in the region, and must have witnessed enormous suffering in your time. Why was this occasion so different? Why were you unable to control your emotions?
Well, first of all, let me say that it happened after the interview. And if you listen carefully, I actually say goodbye. But the camera was in my office and they just carried on rolling. And as I broke down at the end of this interview, they carried on recording it, sent it back to Doha. It was Al Jazeera. And then it was broadcast on the hour, at the top of every hour for the next 12 hours. So it was after the interview. But that was the day they hit our school in Jabalia, when children were killed as they slept next to their parents in a UN school. So obviously it was a time of great emotion. I find it very hard still to talk about it. And, you know, what I said to people is that if my tears at the time focused on the tears of people in Gaza, then that was a good thing. And I make no apology. I make no apology for my humanity, and I make no apology for the fact that my emotional outburst focused attention. And I think it showed to people that this wasn't a UN saying we are condemn this or we are concerned. It wasn't a sort of pro forma statement. The feeling of indignation and outrage in the UN was real and genuine and visceral. And I think that episode demonstrated to a lot of people that that was the case, which is why I think it went viral. People suddenly thought, wow, the UN really does care about this. The UN is very upset about it.
But your words and the emotion on the occasion impacted, as you've obviously discovered, on all who watched that interview. You said, and these are your words, the rights of Palestinians, even their children, and are wholesale denied, and it's appalling. Were you aware that you were perhaps departing from the normal UN protocols by speaking so openly?
I mean, I think that we in UNWRA certainly have said many times. I remember writing an editorial at the time of the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, and I went through all 30-something rights in the Declaration, and it was hard to conclude anything else but the fact that Palestinians and their children are wholesale denied their rights. I mean, the right to life. You name every right in the Universal Declaration. Essentially, it's denied the Palestinians. So I stand by that. I think the rights of Palestinians are wholesale denied, and the rights of their children are wholesale.
I suppose you took some comfort a bit when you heard the words of the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon just a little bit time later. It was the 7th time a UN shelter had been hit in the 27 days of the Gaza conflict. The victims had all taken shelter in the schools after being instructed by the Israeli military to leave their homes. And the attack was described by Ban Ki-moon as a moral outrage and a criminal act. There he is, he's speaking even more profoundly than you.
And the State Department, by the way, also made a very, very strong statement indeed. So, it wasn't just UNWRA saying this. There were some very powerful political forces. President Obama himself talked about the fact that the Israelis had been notified 17 times of certain schools being hit. So I think there was a lot of consensus that what was going on was disproportionate and that it was a violation of international law.
Now, the Ban Ki-moon did go on to say it was a moral outrage and a criminal act. He called for those responsible to be recognised as having committed gross violation of international law and that they should be brought to account. These are strong words. Has there been any realistic attempt to pursue those responsible?
Well, yes, I can say there have. There are 4 processes going on. First of all, we are a member state organisation in the UN, so the member state itself has got to investigate, and we are told by the Israeli authorities that they are investigating. Secondly, we've done our own investigation. We're actually towards the end of it now. The Human Rights Council is doing an investigation under William Shabbas, so-called Goldstone 2 report, and also the Human Rights Council has called on all the thematic rapporteurs, rapporteur on housing, on water, on indigenous people's rights, also to report on what happened during the Gaza war. And then finally, there's Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General's Commission of Inquiry. So there are 4 investigations going on now. Now, I can understand, Carl, why you would be cynical, because there were investigations after the 2009 fighting, and let's look at what happened then. I mean, almost nothing. Israel itself actually did prosecute a couple of people, but the world rightly is cynical about this. All I can say is it was a war which was perhaps one of the most televised wars of our age. I think because UN installations with the blue UN flag atop, where thousands, 300,000 people we're talking about had taken refuge, and the fact that they were shelled, I would hope means that there's a momentum, a moral momentum, a legal momentum, a diplomatic momentum around accountability.
What would be the optimum that you might expect? Ignoring the fact that historically nothing has happened, could you expect an international criminal trial if no proper results came from? What would you optimistically hope for?
Look, I don't want to frighten all the parties by saying I expect to see, someone in The Hague. That wouldn't help the process at all. And me speculating about that kind of thing is not going to help. Let's focus on the victims, because they are the people who want justice. And justice, by the way, is a psychological truth as well. Look, I've got hundreds of colleagues deep in grief in Gaza, and one of the things which is going to help them get over their grief is the truth, is accountability, and is justice. And if I, as the UN spokesman, start making rhetorical calls for this, that, and the other, that's not going to help them. So let's see what happens. Let's look at the Israeli investigation. Let's look at what Ban Ki-moon's Board of Inquiry brings up. Let's see what William Shabbas, the Special Rapporteur, brings up. And then I'll come back and talk to you, and let's see where we stand. Of course we hope there'll be accountability, because make no mistake, the anger which people in Gaza feel is palpable. And as well as lifting of the blockade, there has to be accountability if the people of Gaza and 6 million civilians in Israel who've seen rockets which are condemnable fly into their civilian areas, unless they are to feel some kind of dignity and security, if they are going to feel some kind of dignity and security, justice and accountability has to be properly addressed.
Okay, well, let's then move on to the victims and the resolution to this. The situation back in July was described by UN Humanitarian Chief Valerie Amos as dire. Last month, in an emergency Gaza reconstruction conference in Cairo, we saw pledges, I think, in excess of £3 billion. Now, 3 months on from the assault, is dire still an accurate description, and what difference did the pledges, or will the pledges, make?
It's beyond dire. People talk about the status quo in Israel-Palestine. There is no status quo. Things simply get worse. And the longer these political questions, the underlying causes of conflict, blockade, occupation, dispossession, continue, then things are going to continue to get more and more dire. So we've seen very little reconstruction material come in, despite these grandiose pledges in Cairo. So the name of the game now is get the blockade lifted, get the investigations going. The people of Gaza need to see their homes and their societies and their communities being reconstructed.
Now, I'm aware that the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon visited Gaza shortly after the Cairo conference and declared that, and I'm quoting him, the critical priority remains urgently needed reconstruction for large numbers of people. As assessments continue, we have revised upwards the figures of homes destroyed and the people affected. We now estimate that over 100,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, affecting more than 600,000 people. It's a point of fact, isn't it, that the Rafah crossing has been closed for weeks and most of the tunnels have been destroyed. If anything, would it not seem that the blockade has now intensified? Are building materials actually successfully entering the strip? Are the homeless still living in schools and makeshift accommodation as winter now approaches?
They are. The figure of 100 and something thousand is now, we can confirm, 120,000. We've had 300 engineers going home to home for the last 3 months surveying property. So, 20,000 homes are completely uninhabitable. And even those which are habitable will be on water and electricity grids, which are completely destroyed. So Gaza's only power plant is largely non-functional. So there's 18 hours of outages on average every day. 450,000 people are not on the water grid. So, and so what I'm saying is even those homes which were left standing may be uninhabitable for other reasons, such as public works. Now, you asked about what's getting in. The answer is not enough. And we have this mechanism for getting stuff into Gaza, and it has to be made more functional. We're not involved as UNWRA in making it functional, but it has to become functional, because if it doesn't, I fear that we are going to see a return to this tragically familiar pattern of blockade, rockets, and then massive destruction. And that is a genuine concern. That is something which is real.
And what about the more immediate implications of winter as it approaches?
Oh, terrible. Remember this time last year, the region saw the most terrible snowstorms, and there were parts of northern Gaza which were underwater as far as the eye could see. So yes, plus, you asked in your question, we have about 20,000 people living in 18 UNWRA shelters now. Now, these are shelters which should be used for schools, by the way, so there's overcrowding in our schools because of this. But yes, thousands of people are facing winter in these shelters, and we're doing our best. But these shelters, make no mistake, are places for 1,000 school kids to come in the morning and leave in the afternoon. They are not places for thousands of people to be living 24/7. There are sanitation problems, there are problems with accommodation, with blankets, the cold weather, and as you say, the winter's onset is only going to make things considerably worse.
Now, many visiting NGOs, medical practitioners, as well as obviously the Ministry of Health in Gaza, have reported chronic shortages of essential medicines and medical supplies. How is this affecting the people of Gaza, the hospitals, the clinics?
To be clear, UNWRA runs 20 primary health clinics, and by and large, we're getting what we want. But, we're talking about aspirins and bandages. Primary healthcare, as if you've hurt your leg or whatever. The problem is with tertiary healthcare. If you've got breast cancer, if you've got some terrible sort of trauma, some kind of injury, it's those more complicated medical emergencies about which we are extremely concerned. The World Health Organization is very clear that not enough is getting in, that there's equipment which has been eroded by years of blockade. The hospitals themselves were hit. So, there's a whole range of problems. Some problems predated the fighting. Things were terrible in Shifa Hospital, for example, which is the largest hospital in Palestine, in Gaza. Things were terrible there already. They have babies in incubators which are on emergency generators.
Well, when I visited the Shifa Hospital, I remember seeing young children who were waiting operations that couldn't be transferred out. I also remember the surgeons and doctors talking about makeshift mechanisms for conducting procedures. Is that still common?
It is. I don't know how common it is, because I say we just do primary health. But yes, there's great concern both about the infrastructure in the hospitals and the fact they've been so degraded, it's so hard to get things in, but also the medical supplies themselves.
Now, Israel's targeting during this assault of the power plant worsened already serious problems with Gaza's water supply, the sewage treatment, and the power supply to the medical facilities. How serious is the damage to utilities and the power supply?
It's huge. We estimate that nearly 30 kilometres, for just one example, of water pipes were completely destroyed. Well, imagine what that does. Even 1 metre of power of pipes being destroyed, stops an entire neighbourhood potentially being supplied with water. So it's huge. We are going to have to sit down and rebuild an entire public infrastructure. That's why UNWRA, in its submission to the Cairo conference, has a huge amount, like over half a billion is to go to rebuilding the public infrastructure in the refugee camps.
Well, look, you're talking about the rebuilding of infrastructure. I interviewed the Minister for International Development just a couple of weeks ago, and he was quite clear that there wasn't an appetite for reconstruction. This was, any initiatives that they were talking about now were about sort of sustaining the current situation and immediate emergency aid. He said he could not envisage that the general appetite would return until there was some solution and some sort of commitment that this cycle of violence, which, I mean, there's been 3 sets of assaults in the last 6 years, was assured to be stopped. Are you still optimistic that Gaza will be reconstructed?
I mean, we're the UN, we have no choice but to be optimistic, but that's a question you should put to the political actors, the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli authorities, the international community, the British government, because what we need now is political action. We have moved beyond the realm of humanitarian action alone. We need political action to address the underlying causes of the conflict, the occupation, the blockade, and the dispossession. Unless those things are addressed, there is little doubt, I think, in the minds of most people, and certainly in the minds of most people in Gaza, that there are concerns that we're going to see a return to this pattern of violence, and it cannot happen. It really cannot happen again.
Now, the Palestinian Health Ministry warned just last week that hospitals and medical centres in the blockaded Gaza Strip, as you describe it, are suffering an acute fuel shortage that risks bringing their operations to a halt. Hospitals and medical centres, I'm quoting them, are suffering an acute shortage of fuel needed to operate the electric generators. He said the ministry reduced its ambulance services by half due to lack of fuel. The health ministry cannot purchase the fuel, as you probably know, because of this dispute going on at the moment with Ramallah. And also you've had housing cleaning workers who have not been paid for several months since the coalition was formed, and there's been this sort of standoff as to whether the Gaza operation should be recognised. Can you see this thing being resolved, and how dangerous is that?
I mean, it's very dangerous, because what we need in Gaza is to see, what the people in Gaza want is to see the national consensus government functioning, and it will rapidly become very discredited unless it is, which is why we hope that the announcement that was made in Ramallah a few days ago that building materials would get into Gaza, will indeed produce building materials in Gaza, and we fervently hope that we will now, in the next few days, weeks and months, see the national consensus government functioning together, united to reconstruct Gaza.
Now, it was reported at the end of August, nearly 500,000 Palestinian children in Gaza were scheduled to start new school year. They were unable to because of the military assault. You just mentioned that their schools seem to be occupied by families now making it their homes. Has there been any sense of a return to normality by these children? Have they been able to resume their education?
Well, they have been able to resume their education, but the first day of school, we had a roll call to see who was alive and who was dead. I mean, imagine any school anywhere else in the world where children have to stand there and see whether their friends have been killed or not. So, of course, there's an atmosphere of heightened trauma, and children are deep in shock. There's increased violence amongst children. There's increased bedwetting. There's lack of ability to concentrate in class. There are a whole series of issues associated with the trauma, but we in our education system are doing as much as we can, 225,000 kids, to make sure that these needs are addressed.
Chris Gunness, the UN spokesperson for UNWRA, it's been a real pleasure. And
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.